Quick, you're driving along in your stylish and sporty hatchback after posting a disagreeable meme on social media. But then, oh my god, a standard issue law enforcement tank appears out of nowhere and is hot on your tail. You have only seconds to react before your reckless use of internet communications results in death by high explosive shell. What do you do? Oh, and he's dead. Has this ever happened to you? Have you felt that a standard hatchback lacks sufficient equipment to deal with government overreach? Are you now in custody because you couldn't destroy the forces of tyranny? Well, do the Russians have the product for you. The venerable RPG-7, a tank-busting projectile launcher used the world over. From the jungles of Vietnam to the war-ravaged cities of Iraq, since the mid-60s, the Second World's go-to choice for dealing with cars, IFVs, tanks, helicopters, and even personnel has been the RPG, and its profile has long been etched into the minds of anyone remotely familiar with modern warfare. The Soviet-made RPG-7 is just about as simple a weapon as can be built for the purpose of blowing shit up, its explosive arrival into the proxy wars of the Cold War heralding a new era of anti-tank weaponry, and firmly cementing yet another Soviet design into the pantheon of military technology. The Kalashnikov of recoilless rifles, the RPG-7 is truly one of the most formidable firearms ever conceived, combining the knowledge gained in tank destruction from the largest war in human history to produce a lightweight, concealable, easy to operate, reliable, and utterly destructive weapon, qualities lending to its ubiquity with all manner of armed forces. So what led to the creation of the most recognizable modern anti-tank weapon? How did this simple weapon alter the battlefields of the Cold War upon its introduction? And why has a 60-year-old weapon remained so popular for so long? Like with so many of the things I talk about here, we're once again taking a school trip back to the 1940s, because if there's one thing existential warfare is good for, it's creating the perfect environment for people to come up with new and creative ways of killing other people. In this case, we arrive about 2 decades into the still ongoing battle between armoured vehicles and the weapons designed to defeat them. Now, by the time Hitler and Stalin divvied up Poland in the most blatant example of horseshoe theory in human history, there were 5 basic ways of dealing with tanks. The large and heavy mounted anti-tank guns often towed by vehicles, handheld anti-tank rifles for infantry such as the British Boys 55, anti-tank rifle grenades, handheld anti-tank explosives, and anti-tank mines. Despite all being capable of defeating and destroying armoured vehicles, other than the mines, the other 4 all had their own rap sheets of downsides, the mounted guns being difficult to relocate and rapidly becoming obsolete due to new advances in armour, the handheld rifles having similar issues with manoeuvrability and obsolescence, the rifle grenades being woefully inadequate at penetrating armour or even hitting a target past 100 meters, and the handheld grenades and charges, well, if you needed to use one of those, you typically weren't expecting to be going home. Luckily, a new anti-tank weapon was on the horizon, the shaped charge. I'm far from qualified to explain how these work, but the basic principle of the shaped charge is an explosive that focuses a metal lining through a cone-shaped cavity. You simply place the cavity against the target, which, after the explosive is detonated, will focus a jet of molten metal through the cavity, penetrating a tremendous amount of material through one small point. As per usual, that's a simplification, but what's important is that this technology's penetration was unaffected by distance, and more critically, was much lighter, cheaper, and more effective than the anti-armor weaponry of yesteryear. Perfected for such use as war returned to the menu, shape charge high explosive anti-tank, or heat weapons, quickly became the next big thing in anti-armor warfare. By 1945, near every faction that had fought in the war were fielding some form of heat weaponry. M1 bazookas, the British Piat, and the infamous German Panzer Faust and Panzer Schreck, for example. And it's here where we check in on the commies to see how the kings of collectivization adapted this new technology. As we all know, the Soviets totally won the Second World War all by themselves, which is why for the entirety of the war, the commies utilized thousands of M1 bazookas provided under the American Lend-Lease program, along with whatever captured German weapons they could get their hands on to destroy enemy armor. Well, I mean, they also had the PTRS, PTRD, and Katyusha, but in terms of the newfangled handheld shape-charged weapons, the Soviets were totally reliant on foreign arms, and it certainly wasn't for a lack of trying. Obviously, this didn't jive too well with the Soviet leadership, and after it became apparent that their prototype shape-charged weapons weren't gonna cut it, development of what was known as the LPG-44 began in 1944. Over the next year, a team led by G.P. Leminski at the main artillery directorate Small Arms and Mortar Research Range would attempt to combine the best of the American and German designs into a new, compact, light, reloadable anti-tank launcher for the Red Army, which they didn't do. Okay, that's not quite true. They did produce what we now know as the RPG-1, which was compact, light, and reloadable, but too many problems arose with its PG-70 heat round that the program was purged in 1948. Just the weapon, not the guys working on it. This wouldn't be the end of the Soviet search for a new anti-tank weapon, however, and before the RPG-1 was scratched off the list, the Ministry of Agriculture had begun work on the DRG-40 and its accompanying PG-80 projectile. What the fuck is the Ministry of Agriculture doing making an anti-tank launcher, I hear you asking? Well, the GSKB-30 Machine Building Design Bureau developing the new weapon had previously been a munitions factory during the war, and still had most of its arms experts, so in 1947, off to work they went. Within a year, the DRG-40 had become the RPG-2, and it was a major improvement over its predecessor, offering a much cheaper, lighter, simpler, and deadlier anti-tank capability. Its enlarged projectile also offered twice the range and velocity, a much flatter trajectory, and a third more penetration than the PG-70. So, from 1954 onward, it became the standard anti-tank weapon of not just the Soviet Union, but their totally voluntary allies in the Warsaw Pact, along with Red China. It was good, but not great, and so the quest continued for the perfect tank-busting weapon. By 1958, someone with a brain finally transferred Soviet rocket developments from the Ministry of Agriculture and expanded it into its own facility just outside Moscow, where improvements on the RPG-2 were quickly produced. In less than a year, the RPG-4 would arrive on the scene, improving upon its predecessor by introducing an expansion chamber toward the rear of the weapon, which increased muzzle velocity and range, along with a conical blast deflector to better protect the gunner, as well as using a marginally improved projectile. This model was also compatible with an advanced optical sight, something which would find itself featured on the RPG-4's competitor, the then in development RPS-250. As with the likes of the SVD and AK-47, the commies again pursued a unified goal with competing designs, because I guess competition is actually a good thing when the state wants it. Anyway, work began on the RPS-250 alongside the RPG-4 in 1958 under the direction of V.K. Firulin, adapting several overlapping concepts and technologies to enhance the capabilities of the new launcher and its ammunition. These included an expansion chamber and conical blast deflector similar to that of the RPG-4, an improved propellant charge to reduce backblast, chromed internals, a new rocket motor, a rear hand grip for increased stability, along with the addition of improved iron sights and the aforementioned compatibility with the advanced optical sight also on the RPG-4. Compared to the RPG-2 it was to replace, the RPS-250 was twice the weight, bulkier, more complex to train on and operate, and more costly in both time and money to produce, and the Soviets loved it. To the Reds, these downsides were dwarfed by the threefold increase in effective range, greater accuracy, and much deadlier performance of the new heat projectile, leading to the RPS-250 being adopted as the RPG-7 in 1961, alongside its newly designated PG-7 ammunition and PG-07 sight. The next year, the advancements of the RPG-7 earned it the Lenin Prize for Technology, and it's here I want to quickly mention two things. First, while commonly referred to as a rocket-propelled grenade, the acronym RPG actually means, that, which translated from Russian is Handheld Anti-Tank Launcher. And second, the weapon was designated RPG-7 as two experimental models already had the RPG-3 and 5 designations, while a World War II-era anti-tank grenade already occupied the RPG-6 designation. Now, with those little notes out of the way, just how effective was the new weapon on the battlefield? Before we get to its history on the battlefield, let's first address how the Soviets intended for the RPG-7 to be used. Within the Soviet battlefield doctrine, the RPG-7 would typically be issued one per rifle squad and operated by a gunner and an assistant loader, which, spread across a practical battlefield, would amount to at least 9 RPGs on a company level. The RPG-7s themselves would be backed up by single-shot RPG-18 launchers and then RKG-3 anti-tank grenades in case a blaze of glory was necessary. This high concentration of handheld anti-tank weaponry allowed for infantrymen to launch dense barrages of projectiles at advancing vehicles should the need arise. Defensively, the RPG filled a tertiary close-range anti-tank role, used to ambush enemy vehicles if they withstood the Commies' artillery, tanks, and AFVs. Offensively, again, the Red's vehicular anti-tank capabilities took center stage, but the RPG similarly filled its own role, fired either after dismounting or from the top hatches of Soviet BMPs at defensive positions or enemy vehicles. These RPGs were positioned near squad leaders for close control and would be similarly able to provide concentrated anti-materiel fire. As a single RPG would not be able to completely destroy a tank, the tactic of concentrated fire was thought to be enough to reliably defeat enemy armor. In all, the Soviets had a pretty solid doctrine to effectively use the RPG-7, but the weapon was by no means perfect. The PG-7 projectile's design means it will fly into the wind, making crosswind firing difficult. First shot accuracy beyond 200 meters isn't great, and especially so against moving targets. Reloading is a relatively slow process, and its sights can be easily obscured. However, as has become apparent to everyone on the wrong end of the RPG, including eventually the Soviets themselves, the weapon is not to be underestimated, having proven time and again to be much, much more than just a capable anti-tank launcher. Despite being introduced in 1961, it would take over half a decade for the RPG-7 to get its trial by fire, its older brother, the RPG-2, continuing to serve as the standard anti-armor weapon of the Second World following the Korean War and into the early years of the Vietnam War. However, in 1967, American forces in Vietnam and Israeli forces in the Middle East would both be among the first to experience the destructive power of the new Soviet launcher. Quickly, the RPG-7 proved it was much more capable than its predecessor of penetrating and destroying tanks such as the M48A3, as well as bunkers, buildings, and other fortifications. In the hands of creative guerrilla forces in Vietnam, the RPGs would gain a reputation as incredibly versatile weapons, and soon, the quote-unquote anti-tank launcher would have more than just tanks in its crosshairs. Viet Cong and NVA forces would indeed target the tanks the RPG-7 was designed to defeat, often barrage-firing heat projectiles from multiple angles, but arguably their most unforeseen yet successful use came against the litany of American helicopters in-country. Through a shit ton of trial and mostly error, Vietnamese forces became incredibly proficient at targeting especially transport helicopters as they took off, landed, or hovered in place, usually surrounding landing zones with RPGs about 100 meters from the enemy, an improvised technique which would become infamous during the later 1993 Battle of Mogadishu. In a much more brutal employment, Vietnamese forces also utilized the RPG-7 as an anti-personnel weapon, in this case also barrage firing them, but angled upwards so the projectile would drop down on American forces, detonating on branches overhead, which then blew fragmentation and large splinters on a wide area. More in step with its intended use, the RPG was also often employed against the various military vehicles utilized by the Americans and South Vietnamese, such as the APCs, boats, and armored cars, proving so effective against them that units often added improvised armor to better protect the vehicle, along with riding atop the vehicle to better protect themselves. There's a million stories about the RPG from Vietnam, but simply put, the RPG-7 was an incredibly versatile weapon that, combined with the ingenuity of Vietnamese forces, was one of the greatest threats to its opposition during the Vietnam War. As you've probably guessed, this success would only balloon from here on out. If the Vietnamese fell in love with the RPG-7, I don't even think the words exist to describe the Middle Eastern affection for the Soviet weapon. The new launcher got its debut on the Arab side of the Six-Day War of 1967, impressing the Israelis it was used against so much that the IDF would start issuing captured RPGs to its own forces. It would be the 1973 Yom Kippur War, however, that would solidify the legendary status of the RPG in the Middle East, both Israeli and Arab coalition forces making great use of the weapon's anti-armor capabilities and inflicting heavy losses on every nation involved. Through to today, every single time since 1967 that the Arabs and Israelis have had some beef to kill each other over, the RPG-7's presence has been felt immensely, especially against vehicles and fortifications. Moving away from the more contentious areas of the Middle East, the RPG found its most ironic use yet in the hands of Mujahideen forces fending off the eventually decade-long Soviet invasion of 1979. Afghani insurgents took to ambushing tanks and light AFVs from well-concealed positions, going so far as to douse these positions with water to prevent dust being kicked up when firing. Besides destroying enemy armor, RPG attacks on vehicles also served as a means to push infantrymen away from their mobile cover, exposing Soviet troops to small arms fire while the RPGs continued to damage the vehicles. It also became apparent that barrage firing multiple RPGs was a suitable replacement for mortar fire, as well as the Mujahideen finding out the same as the Vietnamese that the RPG was excellent against helicopters, and in fact, the success of this tactic spawned the idea of providing them with US-made Stinger missiles, which ultimately helped turn the war in their favor. As the Mujahideen fractured in the years following the repelled Soviet invasion, RPGs and soldiers trained on it proliferated throughout the Middle East and Africa, joining various insurgent groups like Al-Qaeda and fighting in numerous conflicts as the 21st century approached. In addition to its notable appearances in the Iran-Iraq War, Lebanon War, and First Gulf War, possibly the most infamous RPG appearance in these late 20th century conflicts was during the aforementioned Battle of Mogadishu, where 2 Black Hawk helicopters were shot down on a failed raid using the weapon, along with a further 3 helicopters during the ensuing urban conflict. It should be apparent by now that the RPG-7 has a wide variety of uses, which means we've got some variants to cover. Within 3 years of the RPG-7's combat debut, the RPG-7V had entered the picture, designed to accommodate night vision sights and strangely designated the RPG-7W by the East Germans and Poles, for reasons that have eluded me. This variant later got its own variant in 1988, the RPG-7V1, which featured a detachable folding bipod on the muzzle and the improved PGO-7V optical sight, though as a practical measure, all parts were interchangeable between the default RPG-7 and these variants. The RPG-7V2 would follow in 2001, adding the UP-7V rangefinder accessory to the launcher. All 3 of these V variants intended to offer improved accuracy with advances in optical sighting technology. For use with airborne troops, the RPG-7D was introduced in 1968, being a collapsible version of the RPG-7 to be carried in parachute jump containers, and weighing a couple kilos more than the standard version. Interestingly, this variant was initially labeled the RPG-8 by the West, and around 80% of the parts are interchangeable with the RPG-7. This variant also received 2 iterative improvements, the RPG-7D1, which was introduced alongside the RPG-7V1 and could also accept the improved PGO-7V sight, and the RPG-7D2, which was similarly introduced alongside the RPG-7V2 with the same improvements. These are just the official RPG-7 variants, but countless more foreign clones exist, including the reverse-engineered Chinese Type 69 and Egyptian PG-7, the Iraqi Al-Nasira, the Iranian Sageg, Vietnamese B-41, various licensed copies produced in Warsaw Pact nations and other nations such as Pakistan, and strangest of all, the American PSRL-1, an RPG clone compatible with AR-15 handgrips and stocks, along with all existing RPG-7 ammunition. Oh, and that's another thing, along with all of these variants are dozens more differing projectiles for the RPG-7 to make it effective against any target, such as the improved Heat PG-7M, the thermobaric TBG-7, and the high-explosive fragmentation OG-7V. Now that we've covered the obligatory variants, let's pick our story back up toward the turn of the 21st century. By the time the empire of the Soviet Union was finally torn apart by decades of shooting itself in the foot and repressing everyone it ruled over, the RPG-7 was rapidly becoming less and less relevant for its intended use. Since the early 80s, the introduction and proliferation of reactive and Chobham armor fitted to more modern tank designs such as the M1 Abrams had rendered the RPG near obsolete for anti-tank purposes. Nonetheless, the RPG-7 wasn't willing to go down so easily. Even with armor once again having a leg up on the humble anti-tank launcher, it didn't even matter. Far beyond anything the commies had ever conceived, the RPG-7 had transcended being just an anti-tank weapon, and as its effectiveness against its intended targets waned, the RPG continued to fuck up the days of militaries around the globe. In yet another bout of ironic misfortune, the new Russian Federation's completely justified war against its own Republic of Chechnya saw the hot end of the RPG again turned on its creators, Chechen forces using tactics similar to the Mujahideen to great effect. Notably, the Russians' new, supposedly indestructible T-90 tanks were ambushed and destroyed by Chechen RPG-7s in well-coordinated surprise attacks on the dense urban streets many battles took place on. The brutal battle for the Chechen capital of Grozny alone saw more than 100 Russian tanks and double the amount of AFVs destroyed, many by RPGs, though the Russians also widely utilized the weapon throughout the war, mainly in anti-fortification and anti-personnel roles. Things weren't much better for Western armies either, the also totally uncontroversial wars in Iraq and Afghanistan spawning stories of insurgents launching dozens of rockets at democracy-enforcing tanks, along with a number of helicopters being downed by the RPG. As the 2000s became the 2010s and the 2010s became the 2020s, the RPG-7 has remained in use in almost every conflict around the globe, finding use in the sequel to the Chechen War, the 2006 installment of the Israel-Gaza conflict, the various civil wars in Libya, Iraq, Yemen, Ethiopia, Syria, and Sudan, along with the ongoing wars in Gaza and Ukraine, and the recent border disputes between Cambodia and Thailand. Evidently, anywhere there is a war, people need shit destroyed cheaply and effectively, and be it car, truck, helicopter, bunker, AFV, or even a tank, the RPG-7 is still the go-to weapon to do just that, and it surely will be a while longer before it falls out of widespread use. In terms of modern anti-tank weaponry, what could be more iconic than the RPG-7? Beyond all other such firearms, the RPG is so cemented into the pantheon of military technology that its designation has become a catch-all term for any anti-armor projectile launcher, which if that doesn't communicate the importance of the RPG-7, then I really don't know what will. The culmination of nearly 2 decades of anti-tank experimentation, the RPG-7 sits in the same class as the AK-47 and M2 Browning, a weapon so accessible, reliable, and effective that it has become a staple of dozens of military forces in every corner of the globe. As much as both tanks themselves and anti-tank technology have progressed immensely since 1961, the RPG-7's simple nature has ensured its continued prevalence on the battlefield, along with the seemingly endless development of new ammunition compatible with the launcher. A large part of its continued popularity is this versatility, transcending the anti-tank role it was designed for to find use destroying just about any kind of target on the battlefield, with such effectiveness that tactics pioneered in the dense jungles of Vietnam still cause casualties for modern militaries. Even with the newer RPG models emerging out of the Soviet Union and then Russian Federation, the classic wood-adorned frame of the RPG-7 and its variants are still in production in at least half a dozen nations, and with its major usage in combat to this day, it's likely that it still will be for decades to come. Quite simply, if there is any weapon an armed force should be prepared for, it's the RPG-7. For 60 years the threat has existed, and for the foreseeable future, that threat shall remain. As always, there's more to the RPG-7 than I could possibly cover here, but if you're interested in learning more, the sources I've used will be down below. Thank you so very much for watching. I'll be back to making content on a regular basis, and hopefully more regularly than what I've been doing. That's all from me for now, thank you again, and I'll see you in the next one.